And welcome back. It's certainly been a long time since you've heard my voice. Let's go ahead and change. Well, I guess I already did change that, so that's that. Today we are going to be talking about general equilibrium. In case you wonder what that is, no worries, because by the end of this lecture, you will definitely know what general equilibrium is. So, without any further ado, let's get started. Of course, after we see a Ted Mosby and Robin Scherbatsky salute to general equilibrium. So, we've learned about equilibrium in economics before, right? It's simply put, it's when demand and supply are equal to each other. When this happens, the market's clear such that there is no excess demand or any excess supply, right? Everything clears. So if you've got, a market for guns and the market is in equilibrium, right? What happens is every gun that has been produced has been sold. Everybody that wants to buy a gun, that can afford to buy a gun, has bought a gun. The market has cleared. But most of what you've learned was likely just partial equilibrium. All right, this is like when you have one market, maybe two markets in equilibrium, right? There would be, say, a guns market and maybe a butter market, right? So if you've got a market for guns and butter, or just say a market for guns, right, you're missing out on a lot of information if you just look at these two markets. Why is that? Well, the reason that is because there are a lot more markets than just guns and butter, right? What about the intermediate production stuff for guns and for butter, right? What about the market that actually deals with the raw material extraction required to produce guns? I would say for butter, but the raw material extraction is like get a cow and feed it. Don't let it die. House it, all that fun stuff, right? That market isn't really being controlled for. We're sort of implicitly looking at it because we're looking at like the prices and quantities within these markets, but explicitly we're not getting much with it, right? What about other stuff? What about food markets? What about housing markets, right? You especially need to worry about housing markets when it comes to butter because, well, there has to be some kind of like farmland that you own where you house the cow, right? So that would be kind of important, wouldn't it? What about other stuff? What about any type of food that is being produced and sold using said butter, right? What about, okay, the cow stops producing as much and you get kind of pissed off at the cow. So you're like, you know what, bye-bye, cow, off to the slaughterhouse you go. What about the market for steaks, right? There's all sorts of markets that we're not really considering in this case. Because the world, as I said, is not made up of only two markets. There are a lot more markets than just that, right? And for example, if we have, say, a two-sector, two-factor model, you've got markets for outputs, labor, and capital in both sectors, right? So you kind of have like, hopefully to an extent, right, some kind of, you're controlling for the labor, you're controlling for the capital, right? The combination of labor and capital goes into this production function, generates output. Now, in that case, you don't really have like a demand for it, but at least you're looking at the supply for it, and you've got two sectors. So if you get spillovers of, say, labor from one sector or one economy into another, then you can kind of see what the spillover effects are and how labor and capital in these two respective markets or sectors or economies would be responding, right? But what we really need to do is look at it in terms of like all markets within the economy. So, in this lecture series, we will be learning about the concept of general equilibrium first in an intuitive sense. That's what this lecture is going to be covering. We're going to talk really about how the models work, what they're designed to tell us. If you hear a cat meowing in the background, it's because she's hungry. Don't worry, she has been fed. She's just always hungry. Then we're going to learn about a dynamic general equilibrium model. This is what's used usually in macroeconomic modeling. We can go a little bit further into this in a different lecture. We'll get sort of the intuition of it in this lecture, but in terms of like some of the stronger analytical components of it, we'll get later on. But we'll learn about how the household makes its decisions, right? How the firm makes its decision, right? So the household makes a decision to basically how much labor do they want to supply, how much stuff do they want to buy, etc. The firm makes the decision of like how much stuff do they want to produce, what do they want to price it at, if it's not a perfectly competitive market. And we're going to learn about how households and firms interact with each other when in equilibrium. And then we're going to learn about how to analyze fiscal and monetary policy interventions in the aggregate economy. Now, these models are used by academics all around. They're also used by central banks when coming up with how monetary policy changes, they're called shocks in the literature, affect consumer and firm behavior. So let's talk about what general equilibrium is. Let's say you've got an economy with a bunch of identical consumers, right? This is what's known as a simplifying assumption. These consumers all essentially have the same utility function that is used to determine their preferences. Since they're identical consumers, their utility functions are also identical. These consumers can choose from two things. They can consume, right? They buy stuff to use today, or they can save. If they save, their savings will accrue interest. If they save more, they essentially consume less if the interest rate is higher. Why is that? Well, think about it from day to day, right? If the interest rate is 2%, you're probably not going to be anywhere near as willing to save as if, say, the interest rate were like 15%, right? If you get annualized 15% real returns on any savings you make, you're probably going to save a good bit more because, well, a year down the road, you're going to have 15% more than what you had now. Now, that's, of course, assuming you get real returns of 15%. Currently, if we have a 15% annualized interest rate, it's going to be around like, I think, a 7 or 8% return, real return that you get because inflation's just so damn high at the moment. But anyways, back to this. They do some combination of this based on the relative prices of each and, of course, what their incomes are. Now, the way that they do this is related through a budget constraint, right? Because you get your preferences over how much you want to consume, how much you want to save. But then you get the budget constraint, which kind of relates your preferences into reality, right? For our fans of a particular podcast, facts don't care about your feelings, right? The budget constraint is basically that facts don't care about your feelings component of this. So it sort of relates our preferences to reality, and it relates the relative prices of each thing within our preference, right? Each element of our utility function. We can get more into that later. The households face a budget constraint, which basically says that income can't be exceeded by the sum of consumption expenditures and their savings. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is income can't be exceeded by the sum of how much you spend on stuff you consume and how much you save. So if you earn, say, $100 a month, you can't spend $80 a month on consumer goods and $40 on savings because, well, you're over by $20 a month. Right? Now, the income can really come from two sources. There's labor income, which is, work. And when it comes to this, if labor ends up being a component or an input, we'll say, of the utility function, they decide how much labor to supply based on the wage rate being paid, and then, of course, their relative preferences for consumption versus leisure. But there's also non-labor income. And this is income from like investments, asset holdings, if you buy bonds, if you buy equities and you get, a bunch of money from that, if you buy crypto and just happen to get lucky enough to make a bunch of money off of that, good for you, right? That would be non-labor income, right? So from this, with the two above considerations, we have the household essentially deriving demand for consumer goods and supply of capital, but also a supply of labor. Right? The demand for consumer goods is just like, okay, if you get, say, $100 a month and you want to buy a TV that is $40, that's probably going to be a pretty crappy TV these days, but, it's just, we'll just normalize the whatever you normally get to $100 a month and just kind of change the prices accordingly, right? If you want to spend, say, $40 on a TV, right, that's great. Anything you save, right, let's say you only spend that $40, the $60 that you save, right, that gets saved in a bank somewhere who then, because of fractional reserve banking, they can lend that out and they can generate a little bit of return and you get some of that return as well, right? When they lend that out, right, they are lending capital out to firms. That's what's known as investment, right? If you remember GDP, Y equals C plus I plus G, right, that investment component is really point two, the supply of capital. Because what's happening is if you save, right, somebody else gets to borrow that. They've got to repay it, and they repay it plus interest, right? But when you save, you are essentially supplying capital to somebody else who can then use that to invest in growth in their firm. But there's also the supply of labor, right? This is like the source of labor income. You decide essentially how much labor you want to supply, usually, the number of hours of labor you want to supply or the fraction of a single period of time that you want to devote to labor. And in deciding how much labor you want to supply, of course, it's, like I said, kind of dependent on, one, your preferences for consumption versus leisure, right? If you want to consume more, you have to work because, well, you got to get the money to be able to consume. Or if you want to kind of lounge around, sit on your ass all day, that's totally cool too. But you're not really going to be able to consume as much. So the preferences for that really determine how much labor you want to supply, along with what the wage rate is. If the wage rate's particularly high, you're going to want to work more hours because that's more money. Why the hell wouldn't you, right? So for the consumer, right, they decide how much the consumer save based on what the interest rate is, right? The higher the interest rate, the more they're going to want to save and the less they'll consume. This is because in the future, overall consumption ends up being higher if you save today. So you save less today, but you get more tomorrow. You get to consume more tomorrow. If you make $100 a month, right, and you save, I don't know, $50 this month, right, or $50 this period, next period, whatever you saved, you'll get back. So you get that $50 back, right? But then let's say the interest rate's 10%. You get an extra $5 on top of that to spend, on top of whatever your consumption would be next period. So you can see that, the more you save today, the more you can consume in the future. And they decide, the household decides how much labor they want to supply based on, as I kind of talked about in the previous slide, the wage rate, because the higher the wage rate, the more labor anyone would be willing to supply. I mean, if you get a gig doing, some kind of market research where you get to charge a fee of $150 an hour, you're going to work a lot of hours for that. But if, there's something, say, I don't know, you get $20 an hour, okay, maybe you'll take it, but $150, you're definitely going to want to work a lot on that. Thus, the more labor that you supply, right, the more income you have, regardless of what the wage rate is, right? If you work 10 hours at $20 an hour, okay, well, that's $200. If you work 15 hours, or let's just say 20 hours, right, that'd be $400. More you work, the more you earn, regardless of what your wage rate is, as long as the wage rate is constant, across how much that you work, or, at least increasing. The more labor you supply, the more income you have, thus the more consumption you can enjoy, or the more you can save. All right, but people kind of hate working. Nobody really likes to just get up and drag their ass to work every day. I kind of don't mind it because I just get to go from my bedroom to my office, which is what would normally be considered a dining room in most apartments. However, for me, I've just got all my computer stuff set up in my kitchen/office, and I work there. So my commute's very short. But either way, you still have to get up, kind of be at your desk by preferably 9 o'clock. And there are other things I would like to be doing besides just, grinding away at work from, 9 to 5 or 9 to whenever work is finished. So there is a trade-off here, because the more you work, the less time off you have to yourself to do things that you would like to do. But on the other hand, the more you work, the more money you get to be able to buy nice things. So you kind of have to weigh this out. It's a really fancy balancing act that is being performed via lots of calculus. Not lots, actually. It's really not that much calculus. But they ultimately make these decisions to maximize what's known as their lifetime utility, because you don't just make the decision today. You make the decision today that makes your decision for you tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And it kind of because whatever decisions you make today are going to affect the decisions that are available to you to make tomorrow. Now, if something works for you today, right, assuming, nothing really, the the facts on the ground don't really change for tomorrow. What decision you made today also gets to work for you tomorrow. So in these models, we plan this out where it's like over an infinite horizon, just essentially your lifetime, and you maximize your lifetime utility. So choices made today don't just affect today, but they also affect tomorrow, the next day, and so on, right? For those of you that have seen Office Space, great movie. Excellent movie. Moving along. Next, we have firms. So we talked about what the household does, right? What decisions the household has. Let's talk about the decisions that the firm has. Now, all firms, just like consumers, are identical. So they have the same type of production technology available to them, meaning they've got the same production function. They produce final consumer goods, and they use labor and capital in order to produce this stuff. Labor is provided by the household, right? Households provide labor to earn income so that they can buy consumer goods, or, they can save their money and then, buy more consumer goods in the future. Or also, you can also think of it as saving for like retirement, right? So their demand for stuff generates supply of other stuff, right? Because I like, playing really nice fancy guitars. For one of the reasons I'll work is to buy more fancy guitars and fancy guitar equipment and all that fun stuff. So because I want guitars, I demand guitars, I am willing to supply work to my employers in order to be able to fund my demand. Therefore, I can actually be in the market and I can actually buy that kind of stuff. Works for me. Now, capital can be owned by the firm in some cases, or it can be owned by the household depending on the assumptions that we're using in the models. If it's owned by the household, it's lent to the firm by the household and then, generates that return I was talking about with savings. So if we assume it's owned by the household, it's generated by their savings of income, which is then lent to the firm who use it to produce. And when they earn profits, they're shared with the owners of the capital. Profit. Remember, for your rule of acquisition 202, the justification for profit is, in fact, profit. So the firm maximizes their profit. They've got a profit function which relates revenues from production and the costs of production. Profit is just total revenue minus total cost. And from that, they can derive a demand for labor, demand for capital, etc. And they figure out how much they want to produce, what price they want to charge at based on what demand is in the market. So they produce these final consumer goods, which then get sold to consumers on the market, and the profits from the firm get distributed to whoever is owning the capital. And remember, for those of you that will eventually be entering the office one day, pushback. Wonderful term, noun. The immediate gratification you get from telling your boss no. So the firm decides how much they want to produce. Then they decide how much labor to use based on what the wage rate is and the rental rate of capital is. They decide how much capital to use based on the rental rate of capital and the wage rate. Now, labor and capital, to some extent, have some degree of substitutability. Now, in the real world, there are some places where labor and capital have a good bit of substitutability, and some areas where they have very little substitutability. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean if it's, say, a particularly labor-intensive job, capital can only help you so much. Capital can make your life easier, right? But the capital can't just do your thing, your job for you, so to speak. Like when it comes to, doing any kind of computer programming for economic modeling. Right, if you're doing economic modeling, well, yeah, the capital really helps, trust me. You need a computer to do a lot of this stuff. You will not ever be able to do it by hand. If you try to do it by hand, a lot of times, stuff you'll be doing would take you, years. And that's assuming you're working at it 10 plus hours a day. So the computer helps, right? But, MATLAB is not yet self-aware. So it can't do a lot of my job for me. It can do the mundane calculations, but it can't do the actual type of thinking that would be required in this case, right? If you try to use a computer to develop a model for you, it's really just going to look at correlations and then just, come up with something that has the highest correlation. But sometimes in that case, just because there's a lot of correlation doesn't mean the correlation means anything, right? You need the economist, you need the guy sitting at the computer to go, do these correlations matter? Does this actually drive anything going on? that we observe, because it's not just find stuff that correlates, it's find stuff that correlates and fits a narrative that makes sense, so to speak, right? So in that case, labor and capital don't have too much substitutability, right? But in, say, the restaurant industry, well, there's a little bit more substitutability, because you can use kiosks and you can use these little robots. There's this great sushi place that I go to where there's like this robot with all these little shelves on it, and the servers will, fill up drinks and stuff, put it on the shelves, like the little trays for this robot. And the robot's basically just like a really tall Roomba. And it just kind of goes around and, goes up to your table and, says hello to you. It's very polite. It's got this really nice, like, super fancy, polished British accent. It's awesome. And it plays music for you and says, here's your stuff, take your stuff. And then, it leaves and plays even nicer music as it leaves. So if it's hard to get labor, or labor becomes relatively more expensive, you can always switch over to this, right? You can switch over to that robot in this case. But even then, the robot can't do everything for you. You do need the human to be able to do some stuff. So, like, if the cost of labor goes up, right, firms are going to use less labor and more capital. Like I said, the robot at this restaurant. I'm sure you've probably heard people say, oh, $15 an hour means McDonald's is going to start using Oops. So the household derives a demand curve. Now, in macro, this is an aggregate demand curve. Now, it's not quite as simple as explained above, but it's a similar-ish idea. And the firm derives a supply curve. In macro, it's aggregate supply. Now, where the aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect, we have an equilibrium, right? But what makes this different from partial equilibrium? Well, for one, we've got labor markets and capital markets that go into the production of the final consumer goods market, right? So if we are in equilibrium in the final consumer goods markets, right, that means that we had to be in equilibrium in the labor and capital markets. So if consumer goods markets are in equilibrium, labor and capital markets are also in equilibrium. Plus, we haven't even explained all the players yet. We haven't even explained all the markets yet. Who could some of the other players be, right? Well, let's think about this. Because we'll also have, at least at a minimum, governments. Hold on, I have a very sad cat. I need to see what's going on here. Mr. Osiris, come here, bud. Come on. Oh, come sit on that. Oh, my big boy. Okay, so at a minimum, we've got governments who tax and borrow in order to generate revenue, because the government doesn't produce stuff, right? They just either tax out of your paycheck or they borrow by selling bonds, and that's how they generate revenue, which then gets spent on various projects. Now, some of these are for things like paying government workers, military, police, etc. Others are for like countercyclical fiscal policy. Remember the stimmies that went out like 2 years ago, right? That's fiscal policy. That was government spending in order to try to offset some of the negative effects of the business cycle or the recession, really, that was caused by the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. But there's also a monetary authority. Now, the monetary authority is doing stuff that you may not necessarily think is directly affecting you, but trust me, it directly affects you. It's just a little less immediate, we'll say, or less immediately observed, we'll say, than governments. Because the central bank buys and sells government bonds in order to affect the money supply, right? And they alter the money supply based on the demand for money and also what the cyclical state of the economy is. Now, there's also usually some kind of counter-cyclical component to this as well, and that's where some of the expansionary or highly contractionary monetary policy comes into play, right? Especially right now, right? In 2020, what we saw was the Federal Reserve massively increase their asset purchases, which provided additional liquidity to the market when it was needed. However, now it's not so needed. Therefore, they're starting to do some contractionary monetary policy. Now, I'm not sure that they will actually be contracting the money supply, but they will definitely be slowing the rate of growth of the money supply in order to try to get inflation under control. The idea behind really the government and the monetary authority, which is the central bank, is that from a counter-cyclical business cycle sort of perspective, is that they'll try to unscrew things up when the economy is screwed up, right? When the economy goes into a recession, they're really going to try and improve economic conditions such that nobody ends up being super screwed over during the course of a recession. It's when things get bad, they make things a little bit more comfortable for everybody involved. Now, one thing that I do want to say is that each of these are used to affect aggregate demand, to increase or decrease it as necessary. Governments and monetary authorities aren't particularly good at dealing with supply-side shocks, but they're very good at dealing with demand-side shocks. So I wanted to make sure that that is explicitly clear, because if the cause of a recession is supply-side, the government isn't going to be able to do too terribly much, but if the cause of a recession is demand-side, they can do quite a bit. Of course, if we go with Ron Swanson here, well, the government doesn't really matter because they don't really do all that much anyways. So because we've got these two players, we have to add a few new markets. We have to add bond markets because the government is buying and selling bonds. We also have to add money markets. And for each of these markets, we will have demand and supply, which gives us a demand and supply of bonds, demand and supply of money. So in our framework, the markets that we would have are labor demand, labor supply. That determines our labor markets. Capital demand, capital supply, which determines our, you guessed it, capital markets. Money demand, money supply, money markets. Aggregate and aggregate supply, demand for bonds, supply of bonds. We get our bond markets there. And each of these guys would get their own equation. And when labor demand is equal to labor supply, capital demand equals capital supply, money demand, money supply, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, demand for bonds, supply of bonds. When all those guys are equal, all of the markets in our model are considered to be in equilibrium. Thus, because we have more than one market that's being modeled, this is a general equilibrium. Now, we can add more markets in there, but that means more equations. And as before, with more markets, say with the government selling bonds, what we end up with is the available resources in the economy kind of get dwindled down a little bit. So if we add a government in there to buy and sell bonds, well, there's now less capital that's available for the firm to use, because the government is also getting some of that. Because when you save your money, let's say you save your money, some of it gets lent to the firm to produce, some of it gets lent to the government. Well, because some of that money is getting lent to the government, say you save $1,000 a month, $500 goes to the firm, $500 goes to government. If there was no government there to buy bonds, or for you to buy bonds from, for them to sell bonds to you, there's no government there. It'd be $1,000 a month going to the firm. But when the government shows up, it's now $500 to the firm, $500 to government. Now, if the government starts taxing as well, you're probably not going to be able to save $1,000 a month. You'll probably be able to save like $750 a month, $700 a month, right? And then half and half. Well, things get worse and worse and worse, as you can see, because there are fewer resources that are available to go out to every single player in the economy. So what we end up with is a situation where private investment gets crowded out by government spending. Therefore, if you alter one of these markets, it generates spillover effects into other markets, which ultimately affects the rest of the markets in the economy. For example, the economy enters a recession. We have a negative demand shock. Consumers begin spending less and saving more. Therefore, we end up with a situation where interest rates are higher, right? Interest rates go up, you save less, or you save more, you consume less. Firms are producing less stuff, they lay off workers. Government sells bonds, they borrow money, to help, quote unquote, stimulate the economy. And when the central bank buys bonds, right, because the government's going to sell the bonds onto the open market, the central bank goes to the open market, buys the bonds. They buy the bonds, they lower the interest rate, because as the government sells more bonds, there are less loanable funds that are available. With fewer loanable funds, higher interest rate. Central bank comes in, buys those bonds. You have more loanable funds, the interest rate falls. That stimulates borrowing. When that happens, consumer spending begins to increase because interest rates are low, so the consumer wants to consume more and save less. Firms hire more labor to increase production to meet the now rising demand for consumers, and the economy returns hopefully to where it was before the recession. So in changing one market, right, the consumer goods, can affect labor, capital, money, bonds, etc. You change one thing, everything else is going to change, and it's going to try to find a way back to equilibrium or to a new equilibrium. And just as a side note, if there is a shock that returns us to our original equilibrium, it's what's known as a transitory shock. Perhaps you've been listening to a lot of stuff on inflation, a lot of the news on inflation over the last, I don't know, probably year plus at this point, where experts and members of the Fed have been saying that it's a quote-unquote transitory situation, right? The inflation is currently transitory. What they mean by that is not that, it'll just last until next month and then drop, or it'll last until next quarter. It means that it could last for quite a while. It could last for a couple of years. However, it will eventually return back to its long-run equilibrium rate of inflation, which is an annualized average of 2%, right? So transitory doesn't mean it ends next month. It means that it eventually ends. Now, conversely, if there is some shock and we find an equilibrium, but that equilibrium is not what the original one was, that's what's known as a permanent shock. So if we end up in a situation where the inflation rate hits, say, an annual average of 4% rather than 2%, well, that is a permanent shock. However, if we have a length of time where inflation is averaging at 6, 7, 8%, and then after a couple of years it drops back down to 2%, well, that's transitory. So it's not a question of how long something necessarily lasts that makes it transitory. It's the fact that it doesn't last forever, and we eventually return to our original equilibrium. Now, because of just the way things are, a lot of people, when they hear transitory, they think that means it's going to last, until next quarter or something like that. No. So there's very poor transparency on the part of various policymakers when they were saying that inflation was transitory. They should have been a little bit more clear on that in terms of what that means, but nobody's perfect. Anyways, rant over. Now, to wrap everything up about this particular lecture, in this lecture series, we're going to be learning about how each individual moving part works in the aggregate macroeconomy. We're going to learn how to derive a general equilibrium, both mathematically and graphically. And we're going to learn how to impose shocks to the equilibrium. We're going to learn how each player in each market responds to these shocks and what the quantitative and qualitative responses are to these different shocks. The point of which is to really understand how the economy responds to shocks so we know what policies can be used to ultimately try to improve the situation, and then, of course, what policies don't work at all. And as we go through this, we'll talk about what policies may work, which policies may not work, which ones have been shown to work in the past, which ones have been shown to not work very well at all. But that is for another lecture at another time. Thank you for watching this lecture, and there will be more to come in this series. Peace out.